Tearing into the charging system on this Suzuki King Quad 750s. Again, like I said earlier in the video, it's going to be identical to the Suzuki 450, 500s, 700s, and 750s. Possibly different part numbers. I can get into some of that in the details below. But as far as the charging system, how to remove it, how to get into it, I've done several other videos on that process when the motor was in the four-wheeler. I just thought maybe I'd shoot a video with the motor out so you guys can see all the components maybe a little bit better. We've got here our recoil pull starter cover, and that's typically where it would be. The newer King Quads do not have a recoil pull starter, so they just capped this off. Why they did that, I don't know for sure. It was kind of nice to have a backup there, but at any rate, it's not there, so we got to remove that cover. It's at 10mm bolts all the way around this. There's 4 of them. Once we get those all loosened up, we can take and pull that off. That's what it looks like underneath of there. This is typically where your recoil pull starter cup would be, right here. It's obviously not because we don't have a recoil pull starter. So we need to remove that nut. That's a 14mm. And that is going to be regular threaded, so you will turn that the regular direction to remove it, counterclockwise. Setting that aside, now we've got 8mm bolts all the way around here to remove our water pump and our impeller cover here. Takes 8mm bolts as well. There's a couple of these bolts, and different from the other ones, there's 3 bolts here that actually hold this water pump on. Those are going to be the 8mm. If you're going to break open the water pump, you've got 2 GIS bolts here. There's no need for us to open that water pump up, so I'm just going to remove these 3, and then I'm just going to remove this water pump. There's a hose clamp that we've pushed up here. Now we can just take our hose and rock that off. And our water pump will actually be ready to pull off of there. You can just take it, wiggle it off of there. There is the O-ring that I was talking about. It can be a challenge to pull off of there. There is your water pump gear in behind here. You do want to inspect that. Make sure the seal is good. Replace it if you're rebuilding this motor. Inspect this gear before going back together. Make sure it's got all the teeth there. Make sure it spins freely. I would pull these 2 screws, pull the cover off of here, and inspect that impeller, because you do want that to be in good shape too. Those can either seize up or they can break, fins off in there. You just want to make sure that those are in good condition. To get back to the stator cover here, again, 8mm bolts all the way around. We've already removed 3 8mm bolts to pull the water pump. Okay, including these impeller bolts here, we've got 17 bolts that we needed to remove. So now our cover here is ready to be pulled off. You can grab a rubber mallet and tap on it in a couple different spots. You don't want to grab a steel hammer and just start banging on stuff. That is going to break this aluminum or at least cause some sort of damage. So you don't want to do that, but you can grab a small dead blow. Okay, and then you can just take your fingers here and pull up. I like to get my fingers in between those 2 surfaces. Be careful, it does have some magnet, some pull in there because of the flywheel and the stator, but a lot of times you can just work it up just like that, and then you get it off far enough there, then you can just pull that. So we've got your shift shaft here, that'll just be able to be pulled out. We've got our stator assembly there. We've got our wire connectors here. If we were going to pull this stator off, it would be 3 Allen bolts and then 4 8mm bolts here. So we got 1 here, here, there, and there to hold the pulser on there. We'll set that aside for now. Like I said, I've done several other videos on how to inspect that, how to test that, and to look at that charging system. Now in here, you can actually see your cam chain down in here. And like I said before, you do not want to drop that cam chain down in here if you are not planning on tearing this far into your motor, because this is exactly what happens here. It's kind of bound up in here. We have done our best to not spin this motor over. If we were to take and just turn this motor over quick, it would bind this chain up, could potentially break some gears or at least some pieces off of our crankcase. Not something we want to do, so I'm actually going to take it at this point so that we don't damage anything, just so we're not risking it. I'm going to take and lift this up and out of here, set that there like that, so it'll be a little bit harder for that to bind up. We're going to grab a socket here, remove this nut, and then we can pull the flywheel. All right, to remove the flywheel, you're going to need several different tools here. I like the impact driver. I like to use a 1/2 inch. I've got the DeWalt 20 volt, works great, does this entire process without having any issues. You're also going to need a 22 millimeter deep well socket. You're going to need a flywheel puller and then a crankshaft protector cap. Now I'm going to sell these. There'll be a link below. Make sure if you want the proper tool, make sure you click on that link below so that you are getting the exact tool that we are using here. We're getting the exact tool that you need. I've had so many customers that reach out to me because they bought the wrong puller. They've destroyed either their crankshaft here or they've destroyed their flywheel here, both of which are extremely difficult to fix after you've damaged those. So make sure you click on the link below to get yourself a flywheel puller, the correct cap here. If you need the DeWalt 20 volt drills, I can point you in that direction as well. This is, again, I said 1/2 inch drive. This is a 22 impact socket. Those are going to be the tools that you need. So to remove your flywheel, first thing you're going to do is remove this nut here. I like to grab a hold of the flywheel because that will keep your motor from turning. It'll keep this cam chain from binding up. With this 20 volt DeWalt here, you're going to have enough strength to hang on to it. I like to grab a rag or something so you don't tear up your hands, but you can hang on to it and twist it off of there. Pretty simple, just like that. You can probably actually do it with a 3/8 drive, and I'll put a link below for those as well. But I like to use the 1/2 inch just so we know that if somebody over tighten this, put too much thread lock on here, we're not going to have any issues pulling that off. Next thing you're going to want to do is grab this cap here. We're going to spin this on. We're going to spin this on as far as it'll go. And this is your crankshaft that we're spinning this on. The reason why we put this on there is because so many times I've heard of people putting the tool on here without this cap. They're going to tighten up this puller bolt here, and you're going to have to push so hard that it damages those threads on the crank. Or I've heard of people bending that crankshaft, neither of which you want to do. So grab the puller here, then set it over top, start threading it on. It's going to thread onto the flywheel there. Make sure you're going the correct direction. Make sure you're getting those on there straight. You want to make sure that it's completely tightened up on here. Thread it on as far as it'll go, and then when it's on there, just give it one last jerk to make sure that it's completely seated. Now you'll grab again with this puller here, it's a 22. You're gonna run this down, and you're gonna start running that down until it hits. And I like to keep my hand on the actual flywheel for a couple of reasons. One, so it doesn't spin over, find that chain. Two, you need to know when that snaps off of there, when it pulls off of there. So you can feel it there, and sometimes it'll just be a quick snap off of there. Sometimes you've got to really impact this on there to pull it off. Sometimes I've had where you've actually got to take a hammer and tap on this. What that does is kind of slams it down onto that crank there, or slams that puller down onto the crank there, and it'll jerk the entire thing off. You will not be able to remove that until you pull this puller off of here. And then you remove this cap. This cap here that's threaded onto your crankshaft is holding your flywheel on completely. So don't just sit there and continue to impact this on there, or what you're going to be doing is pulling this cap that's threaded on here, you're going to be trying to pull against those threads on the crank. And it'll be like, may the best man win, because either your flywheel puller here is going to give out, or the threads on your crankshaft cap are going to give out. Either way, you're going to break some stuff, so don't do that. Pull your flywheel there. There's your one-way gear, and behind there, when you hit your starter motor that's right here, it's going to turn this starter limiter gear. It's going to turn this idle gear. It's going to spin this over, and because this is directional, it's going to spin this in the direction that it needs to turn. It's going to turn your motor over. You let off your starter motor, this gear is going to stop, this gear is going to stop, and this gear is going to stop. So these gears are no longer needed when that starter is not turning over. That being said, you still need this flywheel to spin, so that is why you have the one-way gear on here. So if it is catching in either direction, your starter is just going to continue to spin over because this idler gear and this idler gear are going to be spinning your Bendix gear here or your starter limiter here, and you're going to wear out that starter very, very quickly. So flywheel here, woodruff key here, and I like to grab either a screwdriver and kind of tap on that to push that out, or you can grab side dikes and just kind of pry it out. This gear is not going to be able to be pulled off until that woodruff key is out of there. Okay, once you get that woodruff key out of there, I like to take and set that with the flywheel because the flywheel is magnetic. You can just leave that there, you won't lose that. Our gear can come off. I want to show you this here quick. You put this gear on here, and sometimes it takes a little bit of wiggling back and forth to get that on, and it should only spin one direction. You can see we're trying to spin it both directions. It'll only spin that direction. So sitting on your motor, if you can see, it'll only spin that direction, and that's the direction that it needs to go. I don't know which way is going to help you know which direction it needs to go, but sitting here on the hand, this flywheel is spinning freely counterclockwise. It's not spinning clockwise. If you have it flipped over like this, just so you can see here, it's spinning counterclockwise. It does not spin clockwise. So hopefully that gives you an idea which direction that needs to go on when you're going back together. Now we have our cam chain exposed here. We can remove that. You can see the area here that I was talking about that could be damaged if we let that cam chain get bound up. We can now remove our other guide here. Both of our starter drives here, our Bendix gear and our starter drive, those can be removed. Remove our other cam chain guide. This is where the tensioner put pressure on the actual guide itself. So the tensioner here is slid in here like this, and it'll push against here. So you want to inspect this area, make sure it's not grooved. Sometimes what happens is the amount of pressure that's coming from the cam chain actually will wear a spot on your guide here. So your tensioner will appear to be completely stretched out and out of tension, but it's actually the guide that's the problem. So keep an eye on that. A lot of times if I'm ordering a cam chain tensioner, I will also order this guide here because you don't want one to be worn out and the other one is just going to be shortly behind. So remove this bolt here, 6mm Allen. I don't like to use an impact on these for the same reason I told you up above there, is you just run the risk of stripping these out and then you have a really hard time completely removing these. Once we get it loosened up enough, I'll grab my socket here and I'll start just turning this out. Because of thread lock on here, these can be extremely tight. That being said, going back together, you do want to make sure that you put thread lock on there. There's your bolt there. You've got a washer in behind there. Make sure that that goes back on. It's a specialty bolt here. It's got the collar on there and the thread. This needs to fit snug on there. Remove some of the gears now on the left-hand side of this King Quad 750 motor. We've got a gear up here. We've got your crank gear. We've got your oil pump that's here. Another gear back here. These two gears here are for your balancers. They've got dots right here that need to line up with your crankshaft gear. The reason why they have those, so everything can be in time there and running smoothly. Otherwise, your engine is going to shake really bad. It's going to make all kinds of noise. You're going to end up having some serious issues. So remove these. These are 14mm bolts here. We also have a couple snap rings like here. Your oil pump that we'll remove. Set that one down. We've got one back here on your transmission gear. And that one is removed. We've got your shift detent up here. Some people call them a shift star. And then here's your spring-loaded arm. Those can be pulled off with a 10mm. So that is what the spring looks like underneath of there. Pull that up, just sits right underneath of there like that. And then your shift detent here, you can just pull off. You do want to be careful. There is a peg there that will slide out of there when we flip this motor over, so just keep that in mind. 14mm bolts here. Both of those can be removed. They've got larger washers on there. Make sure you keep track of those. This larger gear here, you won't be able to pull out until after we split that case. This is for your bevel gear, your transfer gear. So there's actually going to be a gear and a nut on the back side of this, and that's what transfers the power from this way to front and back. So that is called a bevel gear or a transfer gear, middle drive gear. And like I said, that's going to control the output shafts going front and back. This, we're going to be able to pull off your oil pump gear and then your chain as well. We'll keep this together. This pin, you can see there, is starting to slide out. We just want to keep that with our oil pump. So I'm going to set this oil pump gear aside. This sprocket here, I'm going to set with the actual chain itself. And then we do have another woodruff key here. You saw me just pull this this balancer gear off. That woodruff key will slide down there. You can see the direction that that gear needs to go. The coupling part of it is down. Setting that aside, same thing over here. This gear can be pulled off. Watch that woodruff key. It actually slid off with the gear. So I'm going to grab that. Woodruff keys are nice because that only gives you one place to put those gears. You cannot put those gears the wrong angle or the wrong place. They can only go on one way. Setting those aside, this gear we'll be able to pull off. There's a spacer in behind here. Make sure that stays with that. And then I'm going to take this larger snap ring, set that with that gear. The smaller one is going to go on this oil pump, but we'll remove this quick before we do that. Oil pump, grab our impact driver. This is a Magneto tool here, and we've got the right bit on there. Take and we'll spin these off. Get those loosened up, what I like to do then is grab my impact. Now you can only do this if you've got a good bit, if you got a good hold on there, and you got a good impact. So I like to put a lot of pressure on here, spin these off. Keep an eye on that pin. We could actually have taken it out. It does hold another washer on there. I'm just going to leave it on there and just keep an eye on it. We had an O-ring, we had a spacer drop down. There's a spacer up here. I'm not sure if that's where that one went. There's also a spacer on this gear as well. So I'm going to take those off, and I'm actually set those with the actual gears. We don't want those getting misplaced. If you put your entire motor back together, put those in the wrong place, your motor may not shift properly, it may not start or turn over properly. All three of the oil pump bolts are off. So we're going to remove that oil pump. There'll be some oil still in there. We'll set that, let it drain, and we'll kind of put those parts all back together. So this here, we do not actually have a special tool for. I'm going to show you how to remove this nut without using a special tool. We've got a little dinged up area of this nut here. That's just to keep that nut from loosening up. So what I like to do is grab a chisel with a fairly flat end on it and a hammer. And then I'm going to replace this. So when we go to order a crankshaft, I'm actually going to just order another nut for this as well. If I were to have a special tool from Suzuki, they're quite expensive. And I can put a link below if you would like that tool. I don't actually ever use one. I just replace that nut. If you replace that nut, they're $20 or so. All right, you can take and start loosening that up. It really doesn't take much. You don't hardly damage that gear at all. But I would suggest replacing it every time. Sometimes I've seen where people have straightened these out and reused them. I just don't like running the risk. If one of these where you're kind of hammering it on or chiseling it, if one of those lobes were to break off, you could have some serious damage down in your bottom end. So like I said, I just replace it. That way we know it's new and we know it's good. You thread lock it, you ding up that area that I told you about, and you don't have to worry about anything else. All right, we'll finish unscrewing that nut. That'll just slip right over our sprocket here. That's actually part of our crank. We'll get that removed. We'll set that aside. Now we can lift this gear up. You do have another fine washer below that nut there, between that gear and that nut. So set that aside. Okay, one more thing before you go and start removing your crankshaft here, splitting your case. You do have a small pin that's running through your crank that we need to remove. If you don't get this pin removed, you're going to have a difficult time splitting that crankcase. So make sure you get that pulled. Got that removed there, set that aside. Now we are ready to go to the other side, pull our crankcase bolts that are around the outside here, and then we can split this case.